I have a translation here?
Yes, you should. It's
this?
here. Okay. Pues, muy buenas.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to Fundación Telefónica and Foro Telos for welcoming us here once again. Apologies for the delay. We had some problems with traffic in Gran Via. There was a demonstration. These things happen in a democracy. It's positive, but this is the reason for which we're starting later, and apologies also for those who are following us on streaming. We're going to have a debate today that is necessary on democracy. Anyone who's observing the 21st century with crisis, one of the other, can see the dysfunctions of globalization, the imbalances in geopolitics, the fractures in our social contract, prosperity that has to be shared by everyone, the dysfunctions of digital capitalism with new technologies, and the political response to these challenges. It is a political answer that is putting our democracies at stake, and we are strangling them little by little, our democracies. If I had to write a book on democracy, I would use Gabriel García Márquez's quote, democracy is not defended by anyone, it seems. And this is important because democracy is the best system not only to defend human rights, but also to include pluralism within our society. And with diversity, different approaches, and also to fight tyranny and arbitrarity through the rule of law. So democracy needs this defense. Today's book has a more intelligent approach. Thank you, Nathan. Johan Cruyff, the coach of my football team, Barcelona. The best defense is an attack, and this book not only analyzes what is happening with our democracies, but it also brings forward different improvement proposals. And this is why you write books and I don't, but this is interesting for us to hold this debate today. And it is very interesting to know what is happening to us, but also if we don't understand, we won't be able to solve it, but also to put forward proposals with regard to how to solve some of the dysfunctions that I've mentioned at the beginning. To be able to hold this debate, we are here with one of the authors, Nathan Gardels. Thank you very much for being here in Madrid. He is one of the co-funders of the foundation, and also we collaborate as Felipe González Foundation. We've got Felipe González who has written the first words, the prologue of the book. The Prime Minister is a radical with a K when it comes to defending democracy. And I think that this will be a very rich discussion. Let's see. I don't want to anticipate anything. I'm going to give the floor, first of all, to Nathan so that he can talk about the book. But before, we're going to see a video sent by Nicholas Bergurin.
Bienvenidos. I'm Nicholas Bergurin. I very much wish I was there with you, not least because two of my favorite people are there. Nathan Gardels, my co-author for the book, and Felipe González, one of my heroes and one of the people that we've done a lot of work with. You're going to focus on a subject that is maybe more important today than ever, and more important to rethink in terms of new ideas. That's the subject of democracy. Spain has, thanks in part to Felipe, become a very, very vibrant democracy. With it, become challenges today that didn't exist in the past. Social media, a voice for everyone, which makes it harder to bring people together. Being part of a world that, in the case of Spain, means Europe, but at a planetary level also means an empowered China. These are important questions. Technology makes it a more dynamic environment, but also a more challenging environment as humans and as part of the workforce. These are the kind of questions we try to address in the book. How do we make capitalism fairer? How do we navigate geopolitics? How do we reform democracy? And how do we think as humans about our futures when we can create or affect us as a species through AI and gene editing? These are the questions that we ask and try to come up with answers in the book. I'm sure it'll be a very lively discussion.
Pues muchas gracias a
Thank you very much to Nicholas for these greetings. The floor is yours.
I would like just for a moment to set the context and lay out the main themes of the book so we have a basis for discussion and understanding the book, since most people have not read it yet, I'm sure. The main context of the book is that the rise of populism in the West, the rise of China in the East, and the spread of social media everywhere has prompted a rethinking of how democratic systems work or don't work. Globalization and digital capitalism have created new classes of winners and losers that the old social contract is not equipped to deal with. China comes into the picture because China challenges the dysfunctional democracies of the West to get beyond polarization and reach a governing consensus by other than authoritarian means, or risk falling behind in second-class status on the world stage. So to address these challenges in the book, we have three main proposals: participation without populism, redistribution of wealth through universal basic capital, and what we call planetary realism. First, participation without populism. Since social networks have drawn more active players into the political fray than ever before, never has the need been greater for the counterbalance of impartial practices and institutions to sort out the cacophony of voices, the welter of conflicting interests, and the deluge of contested information. To mend the breach of distrust that's grown in all of our democracies between the public and the institutions of self-government, participation without populism would integrate social networks and more direct democracy into the political system through new mediating institutions that complement representative government. What we have in mind here are the kinds of citizen assemblies that have taken place in Ireland, for example, on abortion, in France, more recently on climate change, or in Taiwan, where they use an online digital deliberative platform to set the governing agenda and reach consensus. Second, predistribution of wealth through universal basic capital. Innovation, the innovations of digital capitalism are increasingly divorcing employment and income from productivity growth and wealth creation, creating a new and a widening inequality gap between those who own capital and those who only labor for their livelihood. A social contract that addresses this dynamic would foster an ownership share by all in the wealth created by the intelligent machines which are displacing gainful employment. The aim is to enhance the assets of the less well-off in the first place, pre-distribution, instead of only redistributing the income of others after the fact. The idea is not just to break up, we call this universal basic capital. The idea is not just to break up concentration of wealth at the top, but to build wealth from below. To fight inequality in a digital age, the best way to do it is through spreading the equity around, through spreading the capital income around, democratizing the capital income. Third, planetary realism. Over the past decade, our Institute's 21st Century Council, Felipe is a member, 30-some group of former heads of state, Nobel laureates, high-tech entrepreneurs, has gone to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese leadership to build a bridge of understanding. Our takeaway from these talks, which have been going on, like I said, almost a decade, are that conflict with China is as inevitable as cooperation is imperative. Conflict looms because the core impetus of Xi Jinping's rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is to never again fall behind the West technologically as it did in the 19th and early 20th century, inviting imperial domination. But the technologies that China seeks to master today are not, artificial intelligence, for example, are not just another factor of production like machine tools or assembly lines. They're about the control of the flow of data and information and expression, which lay at the very heart of the divergence between East and West. Therefore, conflict. Cooperation is imperative because of climate change. So, planetary realism in this context implies cooperation because of climate change. Planetary realism in this context therefore implies a partnership of rivals between the West and China on climate action. The West and China may well survive the decoupling of our economies from each other, but the world would not survive the decoupling of the climate fates of the largest carbon emitters on the planet. So these are the main themes of the book: participation without populism, redistribution of wealth through universal basic capital, and planetary realism. Our fear, which we express in the book, is that unless the West follows a course along this path, we may end up on the wrong side of history. Now, in each of these areas, there are practical implementation of these ideas going on in various places around the world, not in a systemic way, but they're out there, the sprouts of this new order. So I'd be happy to talk about that in the questions and answer if you like, but that's the main contours of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Presidente.
Thank you. Prime Minister, you don't need any kind of introduction, but I'd like to read the last sentence of the prologue of the book when you say, for new generations for which democracy is given, it is important to insist on giving answers to the governance crisis, to maintain democracy and the defense of human rights as the right framework to manage public spaces that belong to all of us.
Me alegro de verte de nuevo.
Thank you very much, Nathan. It's great to see you again, and it's great to see you because of this event. I'd like to say hello to our friend Nicholas in case he's following us. You'll see, I'd like to say many things. Of course, the book is exciting, but everything that is about exploring answers to the challenges that we have to face, both in terms of populisms and redistribution, in the classic language, the redistribution of income in order to close that great gap that is taking place, or even that definition of that global realism. In what global realism are we developing with China, etc.? Well, to me, that's exciting. I started to explore the impact that globalization has, that, as we called it, or technological revolution, in different aspects of our lives, including communication among human beings, for the first time in history, it removes the boundaries of time and space in order to connect to each other. And that's a real, it's a communication revolution together with a cultural shift or an digital intelligence, and not the analog intelligence that we supposedly belong to. Of course, it's analog intelligence. I'm speaking about intelligence. We need to translate into digital language. So we're not native digitals. My grandchildren are digitals. Even my children, they are much more digital than myself. So I started to analyze this phenomenon more or less where Nicholas is placed, in California, in Berkeley. And I started to analyze it, first of all, because of the concern that I had during my last years of administration about what was happening that went beyond my classical governance consideration to rule the country and the European governance or global governance. So there is where my adventure started. I made a first presentation because this international socialist gave me or asked me to speak about the impact of technological revolution in our ways of life, including politics, economy, social relationships, and so on and so forth. And I presented that report in 1999. 3 years after starting to go throughout all the world, chairing a commission that was analyzing that. I must say that I think that I made some mistakes that I see now. Partially, it was key, the interdependence growth in a globalized society with political systems that were opposite to each other sometimes, and with a power fight that we could see from an emerging country like China, and a country that could go down. In fact, they had some symptoms that could be the US. Excluding the drowning of the USSR that I lived in first person, so to speak. So the first scenario that is described as a personal experience took me to go through every continent with some members of that council that was created to analyze that phenomenon. There's an internal publication or a report about globalization impact, but after that, I started to be concerned because of what I had been calling, and some people that know me know that very well, governance crisis of representative democracy. Something was being damaged in how democracy worked. You know that sometimes I am a little bit harsh when I say democracy doesn't guarantee a good governance. It guarantees that we can send off the government that we don't like, and that's fine. Because as we don't like to be sent off, we try to improve our performance. But if we can't send the government out, that becomes into a dictatorship, whatever you want. I don't either right wing or left wing. It's a government that tries to control the society in a totalitarian way. So I started to analyze that, and I devoted a great bunch of effort. In fact, Nathan, we met at Sao Paulo with Nicholas and with you, and I spent 1 year at the Sao Paulo University, maybe the worst year, the critical year of last years in Brazil, to analyze that problem, the governance crisis in representative democracy. So speaking about the result of the election in Chile, with the chancellor of the University of Chile, he remembered that we had met at the Sao Paulo University, and we had talked about that and about the challenge of education as a key factor even in the pre-distribution, not in the redistribution, but in the pre-distribution. So I devoted that year, and unluckily it was an invitation to spend 1 year at the university studying that phenomenon with 50 or 55 pesquisadores in Portuguese, researchers that were students to different professors and teachers about this governance crisis of representative democracy. It was published at the end of the year. And it was the same year of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment that sent her out of power. And it was in parallel with an increasing tension in the Brazilian society. Well, I continued with my job at the university. It was a great point of discussion and tension, and the parliament discussion. And what really surprised me from the parliament, speaking about new technologies, media, and how it impacts the democratic life, what surprised me the most is that the 500, 600, 700 hours of discussion during the whole year to explain, justify the impeachment to Dilma Rousseff, there was not 1 hour that was devoted to analyze the reasons why this impeachment took place. It was some kind of craziness. It was a total dissociation between the reasons that had been on a paper compared to the other. So this made me much more concerned about this governance crisis of representative democracy. The publisher, with good criteria, told me that this title wouldn't be read in university research centers because, I mean, you wouldn't sell a thing if you put this title on it. This title is more attractive and more dynamic. But I was offered another title. Well, I was offered. I mean, I didn't care. That was as a question. Who rules here? Who's the boss here? Who's the boss in democracy? How much conditioning aspect has democracy because of the independence factors that now, for example, the pandemic has put on the table. Now we are discussing about solidarity so that the vaccines can arrive to the different countries that do not have resources or possibilities to buy it. And not even, I mean, I'm not claiming for solidarity, I'm claiming for intelligent selfishness. That means that as far as we can't cover the planet in a reasonable way with a vaccine, the pandemic won't disappear, and any of these strains will hit us again. So that's not solidarity, that's intelligent selfishness. Any strain in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, 20 days before declaring the pandemic on a global scale at the WHO, I was in South Korea and was one of the flagships. And today they are facing a terrible pandemic crisis. So the book sets, well, I would like to, I'm speaking about that at the preface, something that I feel passion for. How do we look for answers to the challenges that renewing democracy entails? But at the same time, Rocío, I mean, that makes me think how we can defend the basic elements of how democracy works. Not only how we try to see if democracy is something else in the network society than a call for voting every 4 or 5 years. I do not feel tempted to say, well, let's have constant referendums. They've been trying to do so in Italy or in California, and the only successful referendums have been the ones that people want to improve environment, education, and everything, but people don't want to pay more taxes. So if these two variables come together, a referendum would be less vital, so to speak. So, but we need to have a communication system. But among the problems that we've said, we can't cover them all, of course. The rise of China, there's something really striking to me. You know that I've had a very intense relationship, and we've met sometimes in Beijing. I've had a quite intense relationship with China since 1985-86, the year in which I met Deng Xiaoping, who was the great founder, so to speak, not communist but Confucian founder of change in China, the transformation that China has seen. So with that point of view, they were trying to recover their position in the world that, in their opinion, they had lost with the opium arrival in 1840, 1850, in half of the 19th century. And with their point of view, the cultural point of view, they said, we want to, from 2020 to 2030, we want to be on average of GDP that we had when we started in this opium war. So this was the way they thought. Of course, they had to go out of their borders, and I mean, this was the operation, the Kissinger-Nixon operation. By then, Nixon was never punished. In China, he always had protocol house at his disposal, and he used to travel with that gratitude that has no time boundaries as in the Western world. So I just want to well, with this anecdote, I just want to call your attention for something that has cooled down my relationship with China, almost freezing it. The interest of what Deng Xiaoping did, well, obviously it was not they were not trying to democratize China as we saw in Tiananmen linked to Gorbachev's visit. But it was that point of view that I said that it's a Confucius point of view, not a communist point of view. This phenomenology of historical practice that have been acquired, and it is like, well, what works, because the history tells us that it works, we will consolidate it, and what works for others, and it's a historical practice that the Chinese people accept as an improvement, we will include it. So this is why when we see that they are mimicking, for example, some things, and that breaks the rules of the International or Labor Organization or whatever, it is a natural philosophy of life. If what you are doing is better and it improves my historical practices, what's the problem? What's the problem if I imitate it, or if I mimic it, or if I even do it better? This didn't call my attention very much. I understood that very well. What really called my attention was that the methodology. What was the methodology to build that long-term program? But something has broken in that Deng Xiaoping program, and it has broken with Xi Jinping, because he combined, in the political representation, he combined two factors. A meritocratic system, not a democratic system, meritocratic system that went through different education stages, responsibility stages, and elimination stages, and a limitation system in terms of time on the power, so to speak. So there was no Chinese politician that could spend more than 10 years. Okay, so this had quite a funny effect, because you need to think in that you're going to be accountable not with the ordinary mechanism when you leave the power, but on your own mechanism because of the Chinese system. That has been broken down. There's no power limitation right now. So I'm afraid, and this is something that they always tolerated me, but they were not concerned about it. I'm a little bit afraid of the fact that breaking that limitation of the time and the power, combined with Deng Xiaoping's disappearance as the great architect of Chinese transformation and the new exaltation of Mao Zedong, well, now that these anniversaries come to on the table, are changing something key, the effect of which I'm unable to see, not even in the global power relationships. I don't know what the midterm effects will be of this replacement of this meritocratic system with this limitation by a system that, when breaking this limitation, makes leaders eternal, and they can't be argued. I mean, nobody can't say anything. Nobody can criticize them, and as they won't have time to criticize what didn't go well after 10 years, when the office will expire, it will be buried. Okay, so what effect will this have, even in China's success as a technology giant, so to speak? We still don't know. So these relationships that we've tackled sometimes in many places with political leaders in New York, etc. So in these relationships between the West and the East world, there's an effect that is totally that can be reverted, and that's it means that the centers of power have moved from the Atlantic world to the Eastern world. What's being played right now, what the important things are being played in the Pacific. Russia is not a great, it's not a great giant, but they are still an underdeveloped country with nuclear weapons. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? It's not a technological powerhouse, so to speak, and the GDP is still incomparable, even to the GDP that Latin America has. So we'll live in a world that is constantly changing, and the concern for democracy, Rocío is right, to me is a constant and growing concern. So this is why sometimes I'm misinterpreted when I say I don't care about the flag that a tyrant has, pretending that he's a right or a left wing. I'm worried about his tyrannic character and the destructive effect for life that could have. So I encourage you to read the book because of all this. The analysis is really, really interesting, and today I would like to take advantage to remind you once again that foundations of democracy, the ones that made Europe to be able to progress after two wars, to go out of war pathology and the conflict. And by the way, Spain translated that into a civil war pathology, and that was even worse. So the foundations of democracy that were born in London soon before the Second World War, that set the foundations of the Council of Europe, not the European Council, was a tripod of human rights, rule of law, and democracy pluralism. So power division, legal power independence, respect to legal aspects, not for them to become into tables of law, but in order to change it with the rules that the laws have. And this is not a modern invention. Even Socrates said that when citizens, the ones that exercise this citizenship, thought that freedom was about not being abided by law, democracy living is over. We're living something similar. To go beyond legality is an expression of freedom. It's the other way around. It's a threat. for freedom. So this tripod, sometimes I put this example and I see what has happened in Miami, for example. This tripod is these are the foundations on which the living building is built. So this is why I've quoted Socrates, and this won't change. But we don't see that. We live in a society in which what is not seen does not exist. So the foundations are in the underground. We don't see them. When are you aware that these foundations are breaking in order to build this coexistence building? So, as happened in Miami, when the building collapses, when the one who lived at the apartment on the 34th floor suddenly sees that there's no house, no family, no life, everything has collapsed. And after that he's told, hey, the foundations were damaged. The foundations were breaking. But I didn't realize until the building collapsed. So this is not condition enough. This is the necessary condition to organize this coexistence. The sufficient condition needs to include elements like the one that you've just mentioned. The other day, I heard someone that used to be the Popular Party leader, it was Mr. Lasalle, who said, liberalism, the foundations of real liberal democracy, has been betrayed by neoliberalism because it has confused that democracy foundation with something that has generated a terrible distribution of wealth. So I would like to insist just on one argument. You are speaking about pre-distribution and redistribution. I want to insist on something. The capital, the raw materials that we are using to build the current capitalism are data. Data, personal information. All our data, since we are born until we die, and even after, for our heirs. But it's the first time in history of economy, of capitalist or non-capitalist economy, in this case state capitalism in China, that the raw materials, the materials that produce this inconceivable wealth, is the first time that raw materials don't have any cost for people that are using it. It's for free. So the information that belongs to everybody that is here, this is the raw materials for the big platforms. I don't have to mention them. Europe has quite regulation power, and it hasn't have power to compete against European platforms. So that's very well known. But the big platforms are being, as ever, either American or Chinese, but they are not European. So regulation character in Europe. Okay, but there's an essential element in how capitalism drains downwards, or how is it built from the lower levels. Let's go one step further. It's very difficult to accept that what I'm saying could be feasible. Let's imagine that we are owners in the capitalist sense of the term. Let's imagine that we own our own personal details. We are the owners of our personal data. You say, well, this is, you're giving away these data. When you don't give them away, it doesn't matter. They use them exactly the same. But you're giving them away without any consistent information. What are going to use them for, and how are they uploaded in the platforms? We don't know. Let's imagine that someone thinks that we have to regulate the ownership right of personal data. We need to make this absolutely mandatory, and we only can give them away temporarily and reversively during the time that you're interested in. And if not, we wouldn't give them away, because you can build those great oil companies that defined the 20th century, but who were drilling oil, are still drilling oil. I mean, nobody builds a business without paying for the raw material. And the big businesses of our time, the big companies, do not pay for the raw materials. They are using our own information, our most private information, our data of any kind. I mean, from personal health details to any other kind of detail in exchange for nothing. And we're normally happy because our data are circulating. But if there's any solution to share in pre-distribution the performance of this new way of market economy or capitalism, as you say, if there's a procedure, it has to go that way. If not, we need to go to classic procedures, and I'm almost done. We need to redistribute the income so that the imbalance in the redistribution does not increase. This doesn't mean that during most of the time the poverty increases. No. Poverty can be less and redistribution can be worse, except when a crisis arrives. We are seeing in Latin America, and not only in Latin America, people that have gone out of poverty and that consider themselves as middle class know that in a crisis like in pandemic crisis or in the crisis that we had during 2008, 2009 or 10, to go one step down sends them back to the previous situation. And that's not only a matter of concern. This creates social movements that are incredibly strong, seeking for someone that can give them an answer and making democracy accountable of that fail. And democracy is not an ideology. It's just to order the coexistence. So the fail would be for the governors. So we should call the attention about not only respecting the foundations on which the coexistent building is set, but also to seriously discuss from the government point of view the efficiency, the efficacy of the public programs that are able to redistribute or pre-distribute wealth. And this would take us to a much longer discussion regarding education and many things. But I think that we need to pick the ball and we need to say, hey, democracy doesn't always have to respect the foundations, otherwise we will be in populism hands that would degenerate in tyrants. They say that have an ideology, but that's an excuse against fascism, against communism, against whatever. They have ideologies without ideas, simplifications or simplicities that are looking for the culprit. And for the guilty. I don't care how this populist leader is called and what argument they use. I say that I don't care. Believe me, I don't care, because I know that they will take us to the same disaster, to the same fail, to the same problem of struggling fights, and it will end up with coexistence. What we need to ask for efficient public policies, not only democratic governments that respect the foundations, but also governments that have programs with public policies that are efficient. Without efficiency, people will look for democracy as a responsible and not the government that is not efficient or that is unable to fulfill these public programs. This is one step back, I would say, in the reasoning, because one of the things where I made a mistake is that I thought that the globalization and interdependence was irreversible. And right now, there's a reject, much more powerful than at the beginning, of this interdependence that shows what's happening every single day. As we're interrupting the supply chain, we are in extraordinary situations that have an impact on everything, on inflation and on the decomposition of economy. But there's a general rejection of that independence to be so determinant, that is so key for our lives. And there's a request of reindustrialization, of recovery in the EU, and part of the programs have to deal with this, besides fighting against the climate change pandemic. So we are reverting that reasoning that I thought that wouldn't go back. It's not that it can go back. I mean, the interdependence will continue. And in terms of relationships between the two big powerhouses, it's key that we have a level, if not a level of understanding, a level of respect to some game rules that allows us to live without the threat. I'm not speaking about a war. That's the simplification that it's always done, because today war is cybernetic war in its many forms. I mean, that's much more than war with weapons, with rifles, etc. These wars are much less important, although they are as deadly as they used to be. So in this scenario, we have this effort that I guess that you continue with it. This is a discussion that has only started. I mean, do we prefer democratic systems or do we prefer authoritarian systems? We share, I thought that it was with Latin America, but we would say with America, because Trump has shown that he belongs to that group. We share a tradition of dictators, so to speak, the saving dictators. They are the ones that they spoil coexistence for decades, sometimes for an undefined time. So we need to rethink, we need to renew democracy. We need to define that the foundations are the mandatory aspect of coexistence, and we should build public policies that are able to be inclusive and not exclusive, that do not bring people away from each other. And for that, we need to think of what you speak, or you say, capitalism, where everybody takes place. We need to know what big data are used for and what influence do we have. This is multiplied by millions of people. What are they doing with our personal information? This is the raw material of the new great businesses in the world.
Adelante.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up a couple of things that you said, Felipe. On the building in Miami that collapsed. The title of the book, Renovating Democracy, is exactly that, like renovating a building, renovating the foundation so that the building doesn't collapse. You're defending democracy. And a key part of that is reconfiguring the institutional equilibrium that existed in representative democracy by inviting civil society more into governance through new mediating institutions. Because you don't have a situation as we had when representative government was born, where the public was basically inactive. Now with the digital connectivity, you have an extremely active body politic, and you need to be able to integrate that into the system of governance, or the foundation won't hold. The second point, just about sharing capital, just a statistic that shows how rapidly this inequality is growing for the data economy. So in the U.S., the Biden administration is fighting right now in a partisan battle to pass a social package, a social safety package, child care, home leave, climate change issues. The budget price is $2 trillion. And everyone's saying we can't afford this. In only the last year, 700 billionaires in the U.S., mostly in the big companies, Amazon, Google, all the companies we used during COVID to make our lives function, only those 700 billionaires in just 1 year increased their wealth by $2 trillion. So they increased their wealth at the same level as the entire budget of the biggest social safety program in the U.S. since Franklin Roosevelt. So the idea is that the public needs to both, civil society and the public needs to have more engagement in governance and more ownership of all that capital being created in the data economy. Those are two fundamental things for renovating democracy.
Sí, totalmente de acuerdo.
Yo soy accionista.
I'm a shareholder of Google without knowing.
You made a lot of money.
En dividendos.
Utilizan mis datos.
Y no te dan dividendos.
No, porque utilizan mis
Because I'm a passive shareholder, because they're using my data, and I'm not on social media. I just suffer them, and every few days they change the conditions. We're gonna improve the terms for this, and I'm not really interested by that. I think we have time for one question. Let's see. Nathan said that he could explain a few examples of these potential ideas, proposals brought forward by the book to renovate democracy, in the sense of being able to compensate some of these dysfunctions. I include this within the idea of more participative democracy. This is a lot of room for improvement, of course, and to have a digital capitalism that is less polarized, so to introduce pre-distribution mechanisms and basic capital that could be combined with what the Prime Minister was saying, this raw material that he was mentioning, data that are being used not only to become rich but super billionaires. This would be one question, and I'd like to hear some of these examples. We don't have a lot of time, but the other question that is also for the Prime Minister, I'm sure he has something to do about it, is the task that we have in front of us to defend these foundations, taking into account these things are not visible, and they're interesting proposals, but they don't really represent holistic narrative, and it's difficult to mobilize people behind this. What is the political narrative that supports this in comparison to another narrative, this simplified history with simple answers? How do we compete against this? How do we win elections with this kind of discourse? Help us a little bit with this. So both of them, for both.
On participation without populism, I mentioned the examples of the citizen assemblies in Ireland and the citizen assembly in France on climate change. In both cases, they were randomly selected groups of the public that reflected the general body politics of race, gender, region, and so on, that were brought together, independent body, nonpartisan body, in the case of Ireland, to deal with the lack of partisan consensus on how to deal with an abortion clause in the Constitution. The partisan parties were not able to reach consensus, but the Citizens' Assembly was able to reach consensus that not for or against abortion, but abortion should not be in the Constitution. And that body of citizens recommendation was accepted by the Parliament and then actually implemented in a referendum, but they were asked by the Parliament to do it. In France, as people may know, here, Emmanuel Macron, you had the Yellow Jackets, you had the riots about the rise of fuel prices to deal with climate change. The Citizens' Assembly came up with several ideas that Macron promised to implement, including things like not being able to travel on, if you have to travel less than 2 hours away, you take a train, not a plane, no reuse of plastic packaging. Those kind of recommendations came out and now have been implemented by the French Parliament. In the case of Taiwan, it's particularly interesting. In Taiwan, each year they have a presidential hackathon in which 10 million people, online deliberation, 10 million people, half the population, participates online in making the priorities of the governing agenda. So these are the 5 things that the government should do. And then the government is bound to take those into account in their governing agenda. There are many other examples, but these are some of the more, I think, the more powerful ones. In terms of predistribution, what we're doing in California is just one example, and I'll just give one so I don't take up too much time. But the idea is you need to create a base of capital income for people that grows over time as it does for rich people, because most people don't have assets. In the United States, 10% own 87% of financial assets. So in California, one thing that we've done is using the surplus we had last year and then this year, we're establishing a $500 scholarship, college savings fund for every low-income first grader. Those scholarships will be $500 will be put together in a huge pool, invested over time. So by the time that the kids get college level, it will have grown to a value that they'll be able to pay for college tuition. So the idea here is that you are having people participate in wealth-generating assets instead of just relying upon budget expenditure or so on. That's one example. The more radical example is Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has proposed that everyone at 25 in the capitalist societies get $180,000 inheritance payment when they're 25. And this is a pool of capital will grow in time because they'll invest in the economy. So there are different ways of doing that. And on China, we're doing some stuff on climate change, but if there's time afterwards, I can talk. But I'll let the Prime Minister
you had
give
the
us his political
question
narrative.
as well, Nathan.
Huh?
The political question was
Oh,
for
the political
you
question
as
for me
well.
as well. Well, I'm not the politician that makes narratives, but it seems to me that a narrative arises out of the main challenges people are facing. And the main challenges that the democracy is facing, and people in democracies, is polarization, that you can't get things done. I mentioned China. China moves forward with decisions. In California, we've been trying to build a bullet train for 30 years and haven't been successful. China has built 18,000 miles of bullet trains. People don't want polarization, they want performance. So I think that's a big issue. And obviously, inequality is the largest issue. I think as digital capitalism accelerates, COVID accelerated, you could just see the future of inequality in a digital economy of what happened over the past years of COVID when everybody went online. So inequality, I think, is a huge issue for people. Polarization, inequality, and a narrative will emerge out of that, which is basically, let's defend a system that's fair for all and doesn't give all the power and all the assets to a small percentage.
Vamos a ver, yo voy a hacer una... Sé que...
Let's see, I know that I'm going to make a very a statement. I think that in this situation, it's much more difficult. The governmental action, no matter the government that we're talking about, I'm not speaking about A, B, or C, that when I started to rule the country, and I had a governmental action in front of me. So by then, although things were starting to change, there was some kind of handbook that was previously written and that had been written by other European countries that you could either follow or not. That, I mean, maybe you had ideas that were more reformative than others, but in any case, there was a handbook. You didn't have to fight against a level of uncertainty like the one that we're living right now. I don't even want to speak about the pandemic. The only certainty is uncertainty. Even today, the only certain thing is the uncertain. And theoretically, the political responsible is a certainty provider, although it is for changing things. But how can we foresee, or how can we provide with certainty to citizens when the only certain thing is the uncertain? We don't know how the virus is going to evolve, but we don't know how the next hit to the economy will be. Suddenly, we have an inflation that seemed to be buried forever. So what do they tell us to make us feel better? Maybe they're right. I'm not speaking about any specific government, okay? No, the inflation is something that happens from time to time. Because, for example, the basic inflation, etc. So the circumstantial inflation is really low. When this time finishes, maybe in March or April, we will go back again to a low inflation. I'm not an economist, but I tend not to believe it. But when we translate this into prices, and when the salaries don't want to lose purchasing power, what is circumstantial, how long will it take to become structural? No matter the fact that in 1 year time, maybe the oil price goes down or not. So please take into account what I'm telling you. I was a little bit reluctant to changes. What else can a politician expect if you want to make changes and you're changing some habits? Of course, you expect reluctancy. There are people that are reluctant to change. Sometimes with that wealth, selfishness, not only with that, it also happens with ways of life that don't want to change. A part of the yellow jackets phenomenon that was not well understood is that there was a substantial change in the ways of life, and people didn't want to give up on that, and they didn't want to be forced to change the way they lived. So that's really interesting. But when I was the prime minister, and when I had an important majority, this is why Rocío was speaking about votes in order to rule. Well, to rule the country, you need to be cautious with the reforms for them to be solid, and we had to fight against many reluctancies. You can't imagine how many, but it took us 3 years to pass the law that brought us to a health national system that today is supported by many people that used to criticize my reforms because it changed the country's reality. And I hope that for a very long time, because, well, to put an intentional public policy, why did it take us 3 years with 202 MPs? Why did it take us to create an NHS that took off by then? Because Ernest Yuc, he was murdered 30 years ago. Ernest Yuc, as a minister, touched every single key that he had to press in that reform process with the will, in his good mind, that the change could not be reverted, that it couldn't be changed if the government changed, because the NHS system changed. I mean, not if you put a little bit of sand there, had great odds to lose the election. So it was set as something new and not reversible, and it took us 3 years to pass this law, almost the first legislature. It is much more difficult to rule right now here and in Taiwan. Maybe Xi Jinping doesn't find it more difficult. He can even find it easier than his predecessors. So that's the first approach that I would like to make. How to provide certainty in such a time? I think that we need to activate civil society. This that we are claiming for, and this is something difficult for me to find. What is civil society? In our case, in the foundation, we are still doing activism with something that Rocío made up that was called levers. Levers, and we have transversal discussions about, well, I mean, we identify a problem, any problem. You imagine there's the big, for example, the big fires. I participated in a discussion in California, by the way, in May, a virtual discussion, a discussion with the best experts in the world in forestal fires. And I was speaking about prevention, public policies. The moderator was interested in discussion, but he was a little bit concerned in getting into the discussion. And this is one of the elements that affects change. But I wanted to explain the model. It's like, well, let's discuss about what's happening in the world with fires that are what technicians said the sixth generation fires. I see that this has been included in the political language, what happened in Marbella, in Avila, etc. Sixth generation fires that are absolutely devastating. For you to have just a piece of information with higher temperature than lava's temperature of La Palma's volcan. I mean, you can't even think that the volcan is going to be attacked with water. So same happens with fires. We don't understand that it doesn't matter how much water you pour. Everybody's asking for more choppers, more hydroplanes, because water never reaches the fire point without vanishing. So it has zero effect. And we've analyzed this seriously with experts and with NGOs, environmental agencies, etc., without any kind of ideology. So why don't we analyze what's happening in Siberia, for example, that is still burning in the underground, buried in Siberia's burning under the snow? Why don't we analyze what's happening in California or in Bolivia or in different parts of the world? It happened in Portugal, it happens in Spain, etc. So let's study what happens. We started to analyze social and economic conditions. So the empty Spain, for example, when they've left the countryside, well, bushes are growing, that's true. It's a social and economic condition that is ours, but it's not a social economic condition in Bolivia. For example, they've had 1,800,000 hectares, and previous year even more hectares that have been burnt. It's not that people are leaving the countryside, they are going to the countryside and not from the countryside. So when we arrive by deduction after analyzing every analysis, when we get there, well, analyzing every concept, it's like 1 more degree in temperature would produce an important reduction of the humidity level and would produce, of course, everything's related to the climate change, and it would produce an effect that nature is warning us because it's responding to the stress of this temperature increase in forests all over the world, trying to adapt. Well, some parts are dying. So the conclusion is that the only common element is climate change. But that's the conclusion. It's not the previous discussion, because the ones that say, no, climate change happened 10,000 years ago, that was right, that was the last glaciation of the last post-glaciation time, well, 10,000 years ago. And before that, 30 million years ago, whatever. This happens in nature, of course, but the man actions, I mean, humankind is directly responsible of climate change and all its consequences. And I'm interested in that. It's like, well, it's very difficult to mobilize the public opinion, for example. The energy consumption, besides the energy cost, will we really analyze? I've started to analyze it. What's the polluting effect of cars? For example, the big cities. That's the big issue in every big city, Madrid, whatever. Environment, etc. Just imagine that we have an impact of 23 or 24%. So, for example, heating systems and cooling systems are responsible of 33 or 34% of that impact. So, more than cars. But are we really willing to reflect on how we can change that, saving energy? But to do it without prejudices and in a transversal way. Thinking in a reasonable way. Not thinking with ideological prejudices. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm against ideologies. I'm against ideologies that are used as a shield to hide the lack of ideas. They use the shield that is useful for everything. It's not useful for anything. Okay? So, let's see. Can we mobilize the public opinion for specific goals, but knowing that the citizen package, that is a package that has to do with rights and obligations, that is not only a package of rights, it entails obligations. We know that improving research, innovation, development requires an economic and budget effort besides a PPP. Do we know that improving education or health system requires an important budget effort that is usually paid with taxes, or don't we know that? Because if we know that, we can't ask for an improvement in the health system and a tax reduction at the same time. Not at the same time. If you want to do it step by step, that's fine. But the next chapter of Renewing Democracy will tackle efficiency in the governmental action. For example, if the Chinese people say that they are going to build 20 power plants, we would believe it, absolutely. If someone in the Western world says that, I'm not in favor of that, okay? I think that the investment does not justify the answer today. But if any Western politician says that it's going to build 2 or 3 power plants, nuclear power plants, to replace I don't know what other type of energy, from now I can tell everybody that nobody would believe it. Nobody. It's like, hey, there's going to start an investment that will be executed in 20 years. Where will this guy be in 20 years? The Chinese people think differently. So this is why I'm saying this. Now, it's like, just this little nuance. Not everything is efficiency in how the Chinese system works. At all. Not at all is efficiency, despite the totalitarianism that they have there, despite the fact that the big data knows, thanks to the big data, the government knows even when you breathe. But not everything's efficiency. I remember that when I was more close to some of the Chinese politicians that I related with, it was like, hey, the Western world is looking at China, but we don't understand it. And this is what Nicholas Berggren has tried to do, to try to understand China. Some Chinese politicians said, the year that has ended, we've had 89,000 riots or demonstrations that we haven't been able to hold. Can you even think of 89 riots in 1 year? Nobody would believe it. But this is a phenomenon that exists, that is under this safety that everything works as if it was a Swiss watch.
Si he entendido el mensaje, Nathan, presidente, no sé si era...
I hope I understood the message. We have to be specific and take steps little by little, right? Brilliant, no? I would just like to make a joke. Do you remember the first president of the Constitutional Tribunal in Spain, García Pelayo? He was a former exile Republican from Venezuela. He came to Spain and he was the chair of the first Constitutional Court, and he arrived here in 1980. After the Spanish Constitution. He had roots in 2 different places, and then he went back to Caracas. But this was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, he was the counselor of many democratic presidents in Venezuela. He was an expert, and he was a public servant too, and he wrote this book, a small book, and I'm not really going to talk about Venezuela, but this is just an example. It seems that it appears to be, in those days, the strongest democracy since the fall of Pérez Jiménez, but he was already warning this. It is a strong partitocracy with weak institutions, and when one of the main parts of this strong partitocracy goes into a crisis, the other institutions will be contaminated, and considering their weaknesses, any movement can end democracy in Venezuela. And he died almost 30 years ago, and this small book still exists. Brilliant grey movement, right? There has to be a dialogue among everyone. We don't have to fear dialogue. This is something that has made me suffer a lot. Amnesty. If we're in the middle of the street and we're screaming freedom, amnesty, and in Catalonia, freedom, who was screaming this? People who came from Franco's regime? No. None of them. I remember that Adolfo Suárez's concern, let's say, to be able to take that step due to the potential reactions among the people from his party, and it depending on the democratic force. And in heading these claims, we had the Communist Party. This is a reality, and it is part of history. And a lot of people have forgotten this, and they don't know where we come from. It is difficult to know where we're going if we don't know where we come from. Well, I think we can end with this, right?
Gracias, Presidente.